Great to do this finally, Jamie. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, happy to be here,
Um,
man.
can I start with some like biographical stuff? Like, so you're British. This I didn't know.
Yeah, yeah. Grew up in Hampshire,
Uh-huh.
in the New Forest, and
Okay.
had a South African mother, and actually my father's family emigrated to South Africa as well after the war. Um,
Uh-huh.
so they were English, but I mean both were English South Africans ultimately,
Okay.
and then they came back to this country. Um, and came back to the UK because my father became a pilot in the Royal Navy, and then we
Uh-huh.
transferred to the US as part of a sort of NATO exchange program, and then we were sort
Right.
of in the um, diplomat expat British military around DC and that area, so it never really kind of left the little bubbles of Englishness.
Okay.
And I was the
Yeah.
baby of the family. My brother and sister kept going to boarding school. They were transatlantic
In the
boarders, so
UK.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So you managed
So
to dodge that bullet.
well, I mean, I went to boarding school at age 6, so I did the little
Incredible.
Harry Potter thing
Yeah.
for a bit. But after that, yeah, I grew up in the U.S. and people always ask, how the hell did you keep, what you did of your accent? And it was just very straightforward, which was I feared the ridicule of my family more than I craved the acceptance of my peers. So that was that.
Wow. So I've been writing about people like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts,
Mhm.
and they are products of English boarding schools. They were sent away 6, 7, whatever. And it fascinates me that these prophets of ecstatic experience, which is all about letting go, surrendering, and so on, should have come from English boarding schools, which is not always conducive to that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So is that the same with you? I mean, how does that mix? As a kind of, I think of you as a kind of, West Coast prophet of ecstatic experience, and then how does that connect at all, or is that just was this a kind of very early childhood
No,
blip?
no. I mean, it was strongly formative. I mean, in fact, I think there's been a recent book on the Inklings. So C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and that
Uh-huh.
whole crew. And I
Yeah.
think there's a film that features Tolkien. I forget what it's called. Have you seen it? It came out in the
Um,
last 4 or 5 years.
yes, Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins.
Well, okay, so that might be another one that I haven't seen. This one is about his early life in high school. It's the something
Ah,
something club, but then it talks about them going to World War One, and then and then
yeah,
bonding at Oxford and all that kind of stuff.
yeah.
And to me, I wanted to share that with friends. Like, if you like, you need to watch this to get me. Like the sense of camaraderie, the sense of like brothers in arms, like that sort of
Uh,
hopelessly old school romantic shit. You know, steeped in sort of nostalgia and classicism is
uh-huh.
100%. And then there's that old Floyd tune, desperation is the English way, and I think there's something to be said for that,
Hmm.
that there is a, and even the entire obviously British rock invasion of the 60s, but in particular, Floyd, they're riffing on kind of medieval and ancient themes. Zeppelin, especially like Zeppelin 3, where they were up in a cottage in the Cotswolds or something for the summer, like the B-side of Zeppelin 3.
Hmm.
Right, with Tangerine and all those ripping tunes that show up on
Hmm.
Almost Famous and everything else. Like that
Yeah.
was them just holed up in beautiful cottages, consuming psychedelics and getting back to their Celtic roots. And that sense of ancientness, I
Mm.
think is
That old
very,
English folk kind of thing.
yeah. And now
Mm.
there's some fascinating shit about who is it? Who is that wacky ass documentarian, British documentarian who does those
Adam
fucking,
Curtis.
yes, Adam Curtis. You
Yeah.
know how he's advanced the case that there was this sort of deliberate ersatz revival of British folklore, folkishness with the Morris dancing and all the things, and how that sort of wasn't actually an intact lineage. It was this sort of post-industrialized
Yeah.
nostalgia ginned up again. And then even, is it Harold Gardner? Gardner for sure. Gerald
Yeah.
Gardner, the founder
Yeah,
of
that's right.
the neo-Wiccan stuff in Hampshire, my old neck of the
Uh-huh.
woods, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And claiming an intact Wiccan lineage, but actually that was
Mm.
bullshit and ginned up again from scratch.
Yeah.
So in any event, real or imagined,
Hmm. Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that sense of English ancientness, and a
Hmm.
sense of there's always the stories of what came before. Like our house in the New Forest had, my father's study was wattle and daub from the 15th century. you know, as this little sort of addition to the home, you know, and you're just like, fucking hell, there's always the story behind the place. And that informed me. You know, I got lobbed into Catholic school in America. So it was bizarre. And I was like, who the hell are these people? And what are their strange and macabre customs? And how, and what is the relationship between their seeming total amorality and Wednesday confession? You know, and
very tight connection, I guess. Beautiful.
You just wipe the fucking slate clean.
Yes,
No one's keeping score.
Yeah.
But heading west, right? So we went west to grad school in Boulder in Colorado. And then just my wife and I. Yeah. So we met early. Yeah. Met in university and stayed together. Right. And basically sort of did band life before it was a hashtag. You know, we had a 76 Volkswagen Westfalia, you know, and loaded up all of our climbing and skiing and biking gear and just adventured. But there was also this psychedelic magical mystery tour thing that was happening with the Grateful Dead community, and then the bands Fish, and then String Cheese Incident from Colorado. So there was this kind of recurring sense of go and test yourself in the mountains, you know, with mountains, rock climbing, skiing, things that could kill you. And it often did. I mean, there were many, many funerals in those communities, right? But there was a degree of competence and accountability and fundamentally connection to natural, or the natural sublime that was without a middleman, which I did not appreciate the importance of that until looking at the shit show of West Coast ersatz spirituality these days and realizing, oh, that was such a key piece. And then people would come out of the mountains having done those things and then dance together at beautiful festivals, quite often on mushrooms. And basically it was mushrooms, LSD, and cannabis. Those were the substances of choice. People did not drink much. They did not engage in white powders. They didn't do other things. And there were, and often because of the psychedelic newgrass, bluegrass scene, there were these nod and a wink sort of postmodern revivals of 18th and 19th century Celtic, Scots-Irish, Acadian, Cajun, fiddle tune, like folk music.
Okay.
But all twisted, delightfully bent because everybody was tripping. So you would have, I mean, there was one Colorado band that called themselves Polyethnic Cajun Slamgrass. And they would, and on full moons, they would be hosting these gatherings in these old 19th century stage stops in the mountains that all the Wookiees would come down out of the hills to gather. And it was flat fuck pagan. And when they would start ripping on the fiddles and the banjos, it was Devil Went Down to Georgia level shit. You're like, oh, this is some old juju, like this is some deeply old that, and so you go to Burning Man, you see everything's like EDM, like squiggles and wiggles and, very futuristic and otherworldly. That's not what we came up in at all. And, and Wallace Stegner, who was won the Pulitzer for his book, Angle of Repose. He was one of he was also the head of the Stanford graduate writing program that Larry McMurtry, Ed Abbey, and Ken Kesey all went through in the late 50s and early 60s. He said beautifully, said, the project of the American West is, can we create a society to match the scenery? Because American culture to me felt vapid, incredibly shallow and adolescent. But the fucking scenery, once you get, to the Rocky Mountains, is bad to the bone.
Yeah. You don't get that in Hampshire.
No, exactly.
So let me ask you, before we get into kind of Boulder, and I'm interested in how you got into personal development and spirituality. Just on your father, I mean, he was test flying Harrier jump jets. So is that what was he like? Was he kind of stiff upper lip RAF pilot? Not particularly. And do you think that that's where you got your interest in kind of unusual states, exceptional experiences, that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, funnily enough, he was anything but a military man. He had been offered he was still in South Africa at the time. He was like just a fucking derelict. He had sort of come out of boarding school. He had built a motorcycle out of spare parts from the junkyard at age 17, was racing Jaguars, and was just a sort of James Deany kind of guy bouncing around. He applied to the pilot program in the Royal Navy and Cambridge, got a full scholarship offer to Cambridge, but was waiting on the pilot offer because it was twice as hard to get into. And so he chose, and that was kind of the fork in his road. So the only reason he joined the military in the first place was because they allowed him to fly the best planes on the planet. So that's why he went. But he was also a polymath, ragtime piano player, classical guitarist, banjo picker, and really just loved to fly. And so for me, they were constantly trying to push me into to Annapolis, to the U.S. Naval Academy, which was near where we lived, and we had lots of connections there. And I thought to myself, I was like, well, fuck, there's only two acceptable paths here. Either I have to become a test pilot, because even being a fighter pilot would be a step down, or it would have to be a SEAL. And at that time, that was long before the hype cycle. It was just, that was our community. And instead, Julie, my partner, who I met back then, she said, "You're not. You wouldn't last a minute in there. You're actually born to be a teacher." And so that was kind of a fork in my road. And I thought, okay, rather than flying planes to get above the clouds, I was passionate about windsurfing, kite surfing, mountaineering. And so it was kind of a sense of, well, like, I'll get there by other means, right? But I am interested in the high country, and I am interested in precision and consequence and learning. So in that respect, I think probably his biggest legacy was A, interdisciplinary interests, and B, the kind of mapping with precision, edgy domains that others might then want to come back to more safely. So his whole point with the Harriers, right, was that the U.S. Marines were killing themselves because they didn't know how to take off from the ski jumps that they had put on the end of carriers so that they could do their takeoff thing. Right. So he would take planes and push them to their fail. You're not even just try and survive, but actually try and kill himself, but not, and then map it with differential calculus to then teach it to other people. So that part feels like there's some continuity there.
So how did you? That's fascinating. How did you then become a teacher, and what were you teaching in? You were at grad school. You were in anthropology.
Sort of historical anthropology, and a part of that, I think, absolutely. In fact, when my mother died in England, she was in Cheltenham. We went back to our old home place the day after she died, just my brother and father and I. And I went to my old little grammar school, and there was this path full of bracken up to the heath. And I couldn't help myself. I was doing just boop, 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 like such familiarity from sort of age 5. And I started running even faster. And I was like, oh my God, like this little path of bracken up to the heath was the first hit I got of liberation through nature. And I realized without a doubt that that's what I had been seeking in the American West, so, as I grew up and kept going. And so the sense of ancientness and the sense of there's always a story behind the place. Actually, that became my grad studies, was sort of a history of the American West and environmental history, human land use, like how have humans from Paleolithic all the way through contemporary inhabited and lived in these places, because we'd be biking, we'd be backcountry skiing, we'd be doing stuff, and you'd see mining shafts, you'd see Indian rock art, or you'd see whatever, and you'd be like, fucking hell, like we're not the first people here. There is a story, and when we understand the story of how we got to now becomes a whole lot richer and more interesting.
And is that what you were teaching in? And how did you get into teaching kind of personal development, spirituality, that kind of?
I mean, I wouldn't say I do either, actually, but because I was all but done on a PhD, minus my dissertation. So I'd completed my coursework by I think age 22, and then I got a brutal wake-up call from a associate professor who kind of did one of those, in-service training kind of things, like, here's the deal. And because I thought I was 1 year away from elbow patches and tenure, right? That was how naive I was, right? And he's like, it's a rotating, it's a shit show. You got to do your postdocs, you go to these conferences. If you don't get your tenure, you're fucking put out to pasture after 6 or 7 years. It's a dicey game. So that was the beginning of the temping of academia. And so that very much disabused me. And so we went, I took a leave of absence and we just went to teach at a really cool but highly dysfunctional outdoor boarding school in Santa Barbara in California, so that I could spend 2 months a year of school out in the field guiding while teaching history and literature. And then also we had 4 months off a year. So that's when we'd go adventuring ourselves. So it was a pretty good deal. It was a very nice sort of halfway house between university life and adulthood. And that sort of became a thing. But I was like, and then we kind of came to the end of that track where you're sort of like, well, we don't want to be stuck on insular boarding school campuses for the rest of our life, et cetera. And then I was just sort of thinking, okay, why did I want the PhD, and it was fundamentally credibility to do the other interesting stuff that I really want to do. I didn't want to be in the basement assessing tax records and that kind of stuff. And I remember in one class, I came down and one of my professors said, and I'd been up spring skiing, in the backcountry, which I'd also been doing my research on. But I came down, and she said, "Why are your hands so tan?" And it was like, I was like, "Oh, I think I'm in the wrong room." Yeah. So that's when I kind of made the commitment to do the Flow Genome project and write the books I wanted to write and that kind of stuff, because it seemed well, I mean, and in between was a stint of 5 to 10 years of management consulting in kind of integral business, which was my sort of that was the next halfway house into the real world. And then the Flow Genome project was just, well, fuck it, I'd love to just bring this all together into what I actually think is the most enjoyable, most meaningful way to train and grow people.
So you got into kind of integral, and you knew Ken Wilber. You're working with him a little bit. You're in that scene a bit. I know you talked on Rebel Wisdom about it, but tell us a bit about that. Your memories and reflections of like integral and that kind of world.
Yeah, funnily enough, it was actually the headmaster at the boarding school had just given me one of his books, and I think it was A Brief History of Everything. And I was early to mid 20s at the time, and I just remember thinking, oh shit, this is fantastic, right? This is a rigorous model that includes the subjective, that includes interior dimensions, that includes all the things that we were plunking around exploring, and there wasn't a lot of credible roadmaps, outside totally squishy new age stuff. And that was that, really. I mean, because he was just a sort of, anonymous, invisible writer at the time. And then, maybe 10 years later, or 5 to 10 years later, he started the Integral Institutes. There was actually a there of people gathering, and felt like, oh, wow, this seems to be an interesting collection of people. Although I did notice there was an absolute bifurcation of what seemingly authentically and independently switched on folks, which was a very small subset, but they were shining brightly, and many of them were the leaders and facilitators of some of the events and activities. And then a bunch of intellectual wankers, and they were on the contact high of being around Ken's thinking, but hadn't done any of their own original research, hadn't read any of the original documents, but they were sort of puffed up with the certainty of Ken's conclusions.
So it turns into kind of scholasticism. Like,
I mean,
Thomas Aquinas invents this great map, and then it just gets kind of ossified.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, there was a certain lazy arrogance of people who were getting these second to third hand conclusions. I mean, Julie, my partner, actually sort of banned integral folks from coming over to dinner parties because they were such insufferable fucking bores. She's like, no more. Those people just suck. They've got no emotional intelligence, and all they do is just blather on from above the neck, about
and just classify everything into levels. Like, this dessert is so orange level, but this main course is really green or whatever.
Goofiness. So ironically, right? I mean, having spent my entire 20s looking for sort of a Gandalf or a Dumbledore, like, who can tell me what these experiences are we're having as kind of accidental mystics? What is this? Who are we? And how do we get better at it, good at it, best at it? Right. And constantly was disappointed, frustrated with teachers and mentors who just turned out not to be all that when you really, got into it. And with Ken, I literally, I mean, it was the first time I felt like Lancelot willing to lay down his sword to King Arthur. Right. I was like, this is the thing. This is actually the thing. And then, within months, the fierce grace of it was he completely shat the bed on a completely dysfunctional little fiefdom. And the whole thing kind of blew up and went away. So it was sad and tragic on that respect. On the other hand, a complete blessing, because I didn't hitch my wagon to that star. And many of the folks, the really good people that we did meet during that time have become lifelong friends and partners and collaborators. So out of that diaspora, there was tremendous amounts of productivity and lifelong relationships forged. So I'm super grateful for it. But my recommendation to folks, because that seems like there's been a sort of third wave of integral lately. There's been sort of people
maybe
piping off about spiral dynamics and this and that. People who clearly late to the party. They weren't part of that early 2000s thing, but they're now really stoked on spiral dynamics or integral models. And
Yeah.
my advice is always, I think that integral theory is something best deeply studied and then promptly forgotten.
Right. Okay. So tell me, did you also on the faculty of Essendon? Did that come after you started the Flow Genome project, or what came first?
No, actually, we had some friend. We had in our mountain guiding kind of and backcountry education phase, because I started co-founded a place called the High Mountain Institute, which was sort of outward bound knoll, so very much that kind of Kurt Hahn, Paul Petzold pedagogy of experiential learning, with advanced placement, international baccalaureate caliber academics. So there we would take kids from boarding schools around the country and the world, and we would spend 2 weeks at this mountain campus, living in cabins, heating with wood stoves and lanterns, the whole bit, and then going out into the backcountry for immersions. And we would do, towing sleds and sleeping in snow caves and doing black bear hibernation studies, but also reading, Jack London's, poetry about Alaska. So like fully integrated, interdisciplinary plus experiential learning.
Oh, yeah.
And combining science, combining literature, history, all the things, plus mountaineering, backcountry skiing, any and all those things. So for me, that was the tits, right? I mean, that was the absolute most enjoyable, most real, most engaging form of dynamic learning. And at the same time, my wife Julie was also a head of school for a Montessori school. So Montessori education and pedagogy, plus developmental theory, plus experiential learning was kind of the triad that then has formed the foundational bedrock of Flow Genome Project, and kind of what we attempt to share with grown-ups now.
Right. And out of that, did Stealing Fire emerge from that, or
Stealing Fire was I helped my co-author write his prior book for a year, and basically dumped out all my puzzle pieces on flow states and and developmental theory and everything else. And then we're cracking on another book. I'm like, I'm not going to do the Cyrano de Bergerac thing again. I helped you, you helped me. So Stealing Fire was 85% my life and my experiences, and it was my love letter to this sort of hidden invisible lineage across time and space. Because as I was having these unintentional non-ordinary state experiences, I would always be like, I'd shoot the moon and then come back and go, what the ever living fuck was that about? And then look back into the past and say, okay, where are some precedents? Where are some people that were clearly barking up similar trees? And then, and so how do we contextualize this? How do we better understand what was going on? So for a long time, that was sociocultural analysis, comparative religious, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And then in the last, 10 to 15 years, but definitely the last 10 in particular, it also became kind of neurophysiological. Like, okay, now we can really see not only are there similarities across time and space of people having not dissimilar experiences, but we also can start understanding the explanatory mechanisms underneath. And then that just kind of gives us the chance to demystify a lot of them. And the whole idea of stripping out the mythologies that they come bundled in, whether it's you spin around 3 times this way or that way, whether it's to this god or on that, that phase of the moon or whatever, or it's just actually, here's the 3 things that really did it versus here's the 25 things you were forced to remember in a lineage transmission. And then really just saying, hey, we can open source more of these things to more people, so more people can more reliably get to those places, so we can actually keep the inquiry going, and let's start actually mapping those places versus getting fixated on the ways we get there. And I think the psychedelic renaissance is being hampered by that massively these days. Where we're all talking about efficacy, and we're talking about depression and anxiety, and we're the medicalization model and dosages and this and that. But it's like, where are we getting? Because the experiences of awe and ineffability, and even the domains that we appear to be more or less reliably coming and going from, let's actually start mapping that terrain. Instead of sort of this sort of, almost pinky swear agreement, let's not talk about it because that's going to freak out the fucking politicians, that we're trying to get this passed right now.
Interesting. I want to ask you more about that. In terms of like writing a book with someone else, what's that like? How was that experience? Was he another kind of bail Dumbledore to be candid, or
No, I mean the absolute benefit is having the accountability partner that if on a Sunday night you're flaked out and you're like, just didn't happen today, but you have an 8 a.m. writing meeting and you need those 500 words, fantastic for that. Everything else was ridiculously inefficient. And there was a certain frequency in that book where I knew exactly what I was writing and exactly what needed to get through, and both the editor and the co-writer couldn't handle it or hold it. And
because of the psychedelic stuff, or
but everything. I mean, everything from Burning Man to to the descriptions
Tantra.
I mean, we re-edited the 1,500 words that was called "Taking the Kink Out of Kinky" more times than entire other sections of the book ever got.
So you really did try to take the kink out of kinky.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. So, but the flip side is that I also knew that book was going to be the most commercial thing I ever wrote, because I wasn't going back to relitigate those points ever again. Right. Like if you read Michael Pollan's new book, it's even tamer than How to Change Your Mind. He's actually tacking back to the middle. Like How to Change Your Mind was his edgiest. And it was clear that, that book, bless his heart, I mean, it touched a lot, it has shifted more people's lives because it was so accessible, but he was an outsider looking in. He was not an initiate into the psychedelic mysteries. He was a nebbishy neurotic journalist.
Which is maybe why it kind of worked.
Yeah. Like peering through the plate glass window and going, that looks fascinating and scary, fascinating, scary, fascinating, scary, but not describing actually the experiences from the inside out.
Yeah. So
yes.
I mean, so we both wrote a book on ecstatic experiences, came out in the same month in 2017.
Oh, really? Nice.
Yeah. But you, as far as I see, you took this. I remember doing my talks about that book, and I felt like uncomfortable talking about ecstatic experiences to an English audience, like to kind of, hey, and I could sense the awkwardness in the room, just of how the English relate to ecstatic experiences. I wonder, first of all, do you think that's different in the States? What when you use that word ecstasis, what did it bring up in audiences? So that's one. And secondly, did you take that kind of message to also to business audiences? And I can imagine it going down well with like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs on ayahuasca retreats, but corporations, how did you take that message to those kinds of places?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, the selecting of the term ecstasis, right, of sort of the Greek term, was deliberate, because all the other terms were taken and trampled. They just had baggage and connotations, right? So it sort of felt better to go way back and dust off a really old one and reclaim it, than attempt to deal with anything else. And the other is that that prior book that I had played a hand in, The Rise of Superman, was specifically about flow states. And I had never, and the only reason I was ever interested in flow states was because they served as a mainstreamable descriptor of non-ordinary states and peak states. But the sense of going into Stealing Fire was like, look, either we're stretching this term so far beyond Csikszentmihalyi's original academic definition that it will no longer have meaning. We will have bastardized it beyond recognition, or we need a bigger tent, of which flow is a subset. So that was the intention with ecstasis. But now when you then, and interestingly, and I had forgotten this, but I gave my son Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, that Tom Wolfe book that famously kind of describes Ken Kesey's origins with the Merry Pranksters and Stanford and that whole scene, the kicking off of Western psychedelia. Yeah. He's like, oh shit, Dad, here's this thing with geodesic domes and strobe lights and trampolines and all these kind of stuff, and that's your Flow Dojo stuff, and here's Tom Wolfe talking about ecstasis. He's like, you ripped everything off from this guy. And I had literally, I hadn't read the book since university. But it was still, must have been somewhere in my brain. So Tom Wolfe is actually the one who gets the hat tip for the use of ecstasis. But then, like when we're talking to SEAL Team 6, right? Obviously, we're not talking about Burning Man, right? But what we could do is you just zone it back to peak performance and a range of states of consciousness. And here's the neurophysiological signatures. And here's what they can do for team coherence, information access, pattern recognition, reaction times, et cetera, et cetera. So you very much can language it to whatever audience, whatever the audience is sort of, available for.
And it seems like it caught the mood. And can you contextualize it in the kind of historical moment, whether that's in the US or wherever? Why do you think it kind of caught the mood of a particular moment? Is that to do with, for example, the rise of the nuns, the decline of religious faith in the US, or how do you contextualize it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, again, my sort of, I think a side effect of my training in the sort of historical anthropology is thinking in decades and centuries, not minutes and months. So hot takes for me are often, the headlight shining around the corner of what clearly seems inevitably coming, but only because you've started connecting dots a century ago or 1,000 years ago, and therefore the trend lines are much more visible to you than if you were just reading the paper every day. So yes, I mean, I could say, I mean, that one of the original impetuses for the narrative of Stealing Fire was just, I found myself at the UN having a private dinner under Chatham House rules with a bunch of people who've just been there, all talking about ayahuasca, legalizing cannabis and Jamaican production in the various Caribbean islands. And then at the end was sort of like, oh, everybody going to see you on the playa in 3 weeks, and then, being down on Necker Island with Branson and that whole crew. And it was elite alpha burners, and then to South by Southwest, and then to Art Basel, and then to all of these things. And you're just like, wait, what is Davos, the UN, Necker Island, like all these things have to do with Burning Man. And you're sort of getting this globally distributed sort of technomatic glitterati going on. And that to me felt fundamentally different than stodgy, being a name at Lloyd's, or being a member of YPO, or belonging to a certain country or golf club, which was very much fixed in place. And now there was this kind of transnational, hypermobile, quite often psychedelically informed bunch of alpha hippies pretty much running the world. And that seemed an interesting pulse.
It's what David Brooks called like bobos, right? Business bohemians.
Yeah, bourgeois bohemians. Yeah. So the Bobos in Paradise, which he riffed on Boulder as one of the sort of hotspots.
Yeah, and Stuart Brand and that kind of elite trippers. So, I mean, you talk in that book about the altered states economy, and do you think that is all the potential for the kind of the market around altered states, which we're now seeing big time with psychedelic market? Is this a good thing, an opportunity, or what's the risk there as well of kind of, I don't know, assholes kind of monopolizing bits of the market, or just maybe cheapening experiences through market forces? What's your take on that, on the altered states economy? Do you see it as an opportunity, or as or what's your thinking on it?
I mean, I think the most informative frame I've come across for it, and it has yet to be proven wrong by the unfolding of events, is Tim Wu's Master Switch book. So Tim Wu is the fellow who coined net neutrality for the internet. He was in Obama's administration. I think he teaches law and information theory at Columbia, if I'm correct. Generally very, very thoughtful, really interesting guy. And his whole thing was any information technology starts out utopian and democratic and ends up hegemonic and centrally controlled. From telegraph, to Pony Express, to telegraph, to radio, to TV, to internet, and then you could also bolt on ecstatic technologies, and including psychedelic medicine, and that's just appears to be what's happening. So I think we could do a lot of gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands, or it's just WYSIWYG motherfuckers. It just is what it is, and these are driving market dynamics, and they will regress towards those means. Now the question is what else might be happening? And my sense is that persistence of the underground is certainly going to keep happening, as well as potentially a resurgence or a revival of religious instantiation, because once you've got the legality hurdle knocked down a bit, then you have because what we haven't had, we've got Native American church, we've got Santo Daime, we've got Udeve, we've got a few quite doctrinal, syncretic psychedelic religions, right, with established right to worship, but they are quite specific in their theologies. often to a point of that being the next highest bar for an outsider to jump in. You have to sort of buy hook, line, and sinker an entire cosmology, which may or may not be yours. And those are the folks that have had protection. But someone like Leary back in the day doing the League for Spiritual Discovery, or some, we're a bunch of, we're a bunch of kids in Marin, and we're going to try and start a church based on, peyote, or, LSD or psilocybin or something like that. Those haven't got very far yet. So the potential there is I think probably greater than it has been. And again, I mean, the underground bats last, right? Like it will always keep on keeping on and keep innovating and mutating. And at the same time, I think it's virtually certain we will also get Prozac Nation 2.0. With new improved 5-HT2A receptors, like that's what we're gonna get for certain. The question is, what else is going to be happening around
it? I wonder if, since Stealing Fire came out and you were promoting it, like me, we, let's explore these ecstatic states. Let's open up to them. I feel like almost as soon as I brought that book out, I thought, oh, I could suddenly see there's a risk of this kind of rebirth of ecstatic experiences being a bit empty or thrill seeking or narcissistic. I kind of was promoting something, and even as I was just kind of promoting, I was thinking, oh, I can see how this could go wrong. I feel like you had something a bit similar. Is that right? Like, since the book came out, and you were kind of, I noticed in one or two of your Rebel Wisdom things as well, you're kind of seeing, the risk of things like narcissism or just empty thrill seeking. You call it like being epiphany whores or something like that.
Bliss junkies and epiphany whores. Yeah. And to be clear, I mean, those trends were present prior to the writing and the publishing. The sense is, and this is the true for Recapture. And let's kind of move back more into the present if we can, with the conversation. But my sense is that just, narcissists gonna narc, right? I mean, we've just got particularly with digital media and kind of self as selfie, we just have this incredible capacity for egoic calcification around the most transformative events. And it wasn't, I mean, it was I think that book came out in the early spring, and it was the following summer, like the summer of 2017, where I really saw a bunch of psychedelic burners who've done all the things, right? They've done all the substances, they've done all the personal growth workshops, they've done all the possible things you would ever advocate for and hope for the rest of humanity to heal ourselves, fix ourselves, grow up. And they were also running a nominal kind of blockchain crypto organization that was then supposed to save the world via decentralized autonomous organizing. So the sort of WordPress of like transformational communities. And they shat the bed in such a thoroughly spectacular and self-indulgent fashion over that summer, and it was precursors of a lot of social justice stuff and but also a lot of entitlement stuff, with a lot of peacocking and then off to the next party and then off to Burning Man. And it just felt like a sort of a swarm of locusts. And that was such a pronounced experience that I went into a bit of a depression in that autumn, because I was like, well, fuck, if those guys are the the sort of canaries in the coal mine, if they are the ones who have had access to all the things that you would ever imagine would heal and fix humans and prepare us for a challenging future to do the hard right things together, and they can't even get to the starting line with their boots laced up, what this is this massive privilege, and they can't do it, then what? And so my conclusion, so that was a dip. That was a good 3-4 months where I was just
this sounds like a kind of Gatsby experience.
Oh yeah.
Was it like this, like you're at an incredible party, and then you think, oh, this bullshit kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's not that I was ever thinking that those incredible parties that we just sort of were getting accidentally invited to were the real thing, but you can always hope. You can always hope that, we just got back from Vegas in a very fancy, again, sort of, alpha burner party for a dear friend's birthday. So God bless him, and yet, right. There was an indigenous woman doing beautiful throat singing with film of I'm assuming this was like Sami, sort of like Northern European indigenous, because there were sort of reindeer toboggans and this and that, played, black and white, and, historic photo, the film behind her while she's in this beautiful kind of headdress and gear, but everybody else is in literal Gatsby, like Burner Gatsby stuff. And I was just like, fuck, like, oh my God, like, it's one thing if she is showing up saying, hey, this is who I am. These are my people. This is the lineage, the song lineage, like whatever, like I'm doing an EDM futuristic mashup, etc. But like, this is where this comes from. And this is this, even briefly, the story of my people. And then if you're seeing those snowfields and those reindeer, like that shit's melting right now. That shit's on fire right now. But none of that happened. It was just a beautiful, young, exotic, right, making background for our fabulous cocktail party. And that just fucking breaks my heart. Like to even be proximal to that and not take some form of a step to amend it. It's like the romanticization of the noble savage. We've been doing, like Western Europe, we've been doing that shit for fucking centuries. And if we're still doing it while the world is explicitly coming undone, at some point it feels unconscionable. It feels like the Hunger Games in the Capitol, that's what it starts.
I mean, I saw an article in the New York Times last week about luxury real estate projects in LA, and they got their own spiritual concierges. So you can get your penthouse, and you not just got a gym in the basement, you got a cacao ceremony in the kind of penthouse. So is part of the problem just the overlap, as you've been saying, between a certain type of kind of global spirituality and real, high wealth? Is that just going to produce these kinds of things?
I mean, it always has, right? It always has. So my current sort of assumption is that the worst people are taking all the best drugs, and that really, if we really want a kind of psychedelic renaissance, it's the beautiful people just don't fucking need anymore. And what we really should be doing is creating therapeutic interventions for doctors and nurses, for farmers and firefighters, for carpenters and gardeners, and midwives, and like the people who have already committed their life to a life of service to others. Because that's the thing, like the bourgeois bohemians, it is almost 201, still all about them. They are seeking pleasure, they are avoiding pain. They just want the most pleasure and the least pain. So they're seeking the mostest, but it is still fundamentally looped through absolute egoic seeking and virtue displaying and peacocking and 1,000 other things.
Kind of self-actualization, right?
Yeah, like run into the ditch in overdrive, right? A sort of metastasized version of it in all of its bleakest forms, because there isn't a structure, there isn't lineage, almost every single long-standing religious tradition has explicit and emphatic terms of service, the karma yoga of it, right? And self-actualization doesn't. And so, like, let's go back to the people who have already self-selected in their dharma, right? Like, what's my life purpose? My life purpose isn't maximizing income. My life purpose isn't gathering as many blinky and shiny things as I possibly can. I've chosen a more selfless, more humble, quite often lower materially abundant pathway because I think it matters, because I think it's something important for me to do. And then those people go out in the world and they try and change it, mend it, heal it, and they get their asses kicked, because the world is filled with an unlimited amount of suffering and a lot of dysfunction, even within the systems they choose to operate, whether that's health and medical, whether that's educational systems, you take your pick, right? They're fucked up and broken. So a well-intentioned person going into those fucked up, broken systems to try and help even more fucked up and broken people often gets fucked up and broken themselves. So can we, right, basically say to the party crowd, you've had your fill, and let's double down and divert our efforts to helping the people who are helping the people, healing the healers, right? And put our efforts there.
Yeah, I mean, so what I'm been researching is spirituality's historical tendency to elitism. This idea, we are the evolving edge. We're evolving into kind of super beings, but unfortunately we're surrounded by morons who are failing to evolve. And what I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is whether that kind of elitism, this idea we are the 5%, is that inevitable in spirituality? Is that a bug or is that a feature?
Yeah.
Is it entirely a bad thing? I mean, like I was talking to, like Jeffrey Kripal about this. And he said spirituality just is elitist. It's just for the few. Like most people aren't into it. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's a good one, and for sure, I think that was one of the definite bugs in the integral code, and it was probably worse, like worst exemplified by Andrew Cohen and his whole evolutionary spirituality movements, because you create the intoxication, the ego trap is, and if you're here, if you're reading this, or if you're listening to this, or you've signed up for this workshop, even if it's just cognitively, so we still reserve the result of, we reserve the right to still pull rank on you, but even at least cognitively, you're already second tier or evolved or whatever. And of course, boom, you've got me, right? Of course I want to be that.
Yeah, it's a brilliant trick.
So it's an atrocious pedagogical structure, but it's also deeply problematic in the leading people up and away from compassion, humanity, and connection. So my sense is that to Jeff's point, to Kripal's point, right? There is, and I think actually Ken did make this point, I just don't think they lived up to it, which is that advanced spirituality starts out unavoidably elitist. There's only a handful of people called to it or have the capacity or the exposure or whatever the things are, but it ends up undeniably or unavoidably democratic, right? That's the bodhisattvic return, right, to all sentient beings or all my friends and neighbors or whatever it would be. Now, the question is how well signposted and encouraged to enforced is that return, the return to humility, the return to service. And so, for instance, I mean, even in the writing of Recapture the Rapture, right, highlighting what does a fully integrated, balanced person look like who has effectively been, quote unquote, twice born, meaning like we're all born the first time, we didn't choose it, to die and be reborn through, some form of repeatable death practice, which has been true for indigenous traditions, through the Eleusinian mysteries, through all, basically all around the world forever. We've had these death rebirth practices. The benefit of them is the Ebenezer Scrooge, Jimmy Stewart Wonderful Life moment of like, holy shit, I thought I lost everything, and now I get to choose to come back. I'm so grateful. Let me kiss the ground. Right. So that's the twice born element. And, in the traditions, that's often called anthropos. Right. So it's a cool thing. Right. And not everybody's twice born yet or ever. Right. But my sense is like, fuck that. Because even just using the Greek terms, whiffs of elitism, whiffs of all these things. So let's detune it all and just call it homegrown humans. And let's absolutely demystify that stance. Because ultimately it doesn't matter to me. I mean, I've always kind of run the grandma on the front porch, rocking chair wisdom. Like if you couldn't say it to your grandma on the front porch, and she didn't grok it and be like, yeah, that's pretty much right on, then you've probably crawled up your own ass, right? It's fancy waistcoats.
You never met my grandma. She was a tough critic.
Oh yeah, exactly. No, I mean, but that's my sense, is that if it's not really straightforward and deeply human and accessible to everybody, you've probably overbuilt your edifice. And so let's keep it, let's demystify it. On the one hand, you can do the death rebirth initiation to the mystery and choose to come back home. Or on the other hand, you could not budge an inch and just be a halfway decent person now. This isn't that complicated.
But is this a structural problem with spirituality, in that religions have institutions to support the teachers so they don't have to be hustling too hard because they just get a salary, and to kind of connect the community to like charities and like homeless shelters and this kind of thing? While spirituality, there's no structures, so we're all out there hustling, we're all out there having to hustle as hard as we can, and it's kind of pay per view, and there's not that connection to kind of charities. I mean, how, let's say we're going to stay, in spirituality without converting to a particular religion. How can we make it less selfish? How can we put back in this compassion, humility, good works?
Well, I mean, I think the simplest is, and our buddy Daniel Schmachtenberger has made I think a good case that wisdom, in this case, kind of personal growth to spiritual development, wisdom has been captured, in the marketplace, meaning that the people with the highest signal are not necessarily the wisest souls. So if you look at who's got the Instagram followings, who's selling out arenas, who's doing all the sexy workshops, who's, you know, whatever is the next new trendy thing, is quite often the antithesis of the Yoda, of the saintly one of the thing, because the saintly ones have no fucking idea how to get a lot of likes or follows, nor do they have any interest in it. And to find them becomes increasingly hard to cut through that sort of noise.
Right.
So on the one hand, there's that. There's just the inverse or adverse incentives of the digital media landscape, and how does a regular Joe or a punter who is yearning but not informed enough to make credible decisions, how can they tell the difference? Nearly impossible. And, you know, so many folks have said to us, oh, like, you guys just keep putting out your clean signal, that people will hear it, you know, and they do. Like, we get these beautiful messages, you know, emails, and people are very, very clearly hearing it. But for every one of those, there are 99 that got met at the fork in the road by the fucking carny ripping us off. And they don't know, right, that there's just a little man behind that curtain. And so you're like, yep, we're sticking to our knitting, you know, we're doing our best to say the thing. And then there's another thing, especially these days, I think there's been a fracturing of monetization strategies in the last 5 years in particular, where you have people who have, however they've done it, through dedicated practice, through dumb luck, through seeking themselves, whatever, they've found some access to source, to light, right? And then the question is how do they metabolize it? Because, like, Mercy's a business, right? But we all got to eat. So unless people are independently wealthy, and I think Tim Ferriss and Sam Harris they're both made men, right? Through investments, through family backgrounds, through various different things, they have actually been able to non-transact in their outreach. And God bless them. I think they're both exemplars of what feels trustworthy and true, right? They tend to stick with their voice and their truth claims better than most. But they also, it's not a sui generis situation. There's an right there's an exogenous support system, and that's not to diminish a single thing they've done. I really respect and appreciate them both.
Same with Alain de Botton. He inherited lots of money, though he's still extremely good at the kind of market stuff. I mean, he's
and some just are also good at that, right? But not that the system as they operate it is also responsible for its perpetuation.
They didn't have to be like junkies. They could follow their own course to some extent.
Yeah. And then, you know, and we've got everything from, you can do supplements, you can sell high margin, shitty things. You can do the Red Bull strategy, which is we sell caffeinated sugar water, but we do these amazing things with athletes, right? Only because fucking sugar water doesn't cost much, right? But we charge more. Or you can do the rattle the tin cup, the Patreon and the Substack thing, in which case you become beholden to your audience and giving them more of what they want. Right. Or you can do cash on the barrel head. Now, we have just simply chosen, to do that. We're just like, look, 90% of what we do is free. 10% of what we do, we charge a premium. We do the Robin Hood model, and we allow that to support scholarships and anything else we do. But on the other hand, now the unintended paradox of that is that we've, optically, like the New York Times wrote an article, like, how to change your mind for $5,000, and so, like, optically back into the spiritual marketplace, we're indistinguishable at a drive-by level from all the bougie rich folks doing yoga retreats in Bali and stuff like that. And you're like, oh, for fuck's sake, are you kidding me? Right. So every single one of them, you have a hit, you have a lump you have to take. There's something that's suboptimal about it in order to create a platform. Our friend Brett Weinstein and Heather, right? I mean, they're going through the ringer right now with the whole COVID stuff and things like that, and instantly lost half of their family income because YouTube demonetized their platform. And the question is, like, now, how does that inform what they do next? It's not immaterial.
Sure. It means they're going to follow the other kind of market incentives, and they're going to end up on Fox News. Right?
Well, exactly. And meanwhile, their Patreon account has skyrocketed because now they're seen as culture warriors who are actually now thin ends of the wedge for a captive audience that's not even their audience, but wants them as credible people to be breaking down the walls, as the battering ram for a different agenda. So you're like, this gets very complicated and tricky for everybody. So I have sympathy for everybody who's we're all trying to find our way through differently. And we've all got opinions on how everyone else is doing it. Right. And then the question is does the selection of the business model we opt for or default into, does it support or thwart the integrity of our message? And if so, to what extent are the trade-offs necessary and manageable, or are they actually perverting and corrupting?
How do you think the spiritual but not religious scene in the States has done during the pandemic?
I'm imagining it's mutated and exploded, right? I mean, we've got all the wackiness. I mean, what I've really seen that's just so it's so disappointing that I can't, like, literally I told you, I was like, I can't say yes to keep going to these kinds of parties and gatherings because I'm just going to be antisocial. I'm not going to be kind, because the mutation of gospel of wealth, the whole prosperity thing, secret, new thought, like that whole chunk of shit, plus multi-level marketing into information marketing, that whole kind of genre, plus psychedelic new age evolutionary elitism into anti-vax, is such a rat's nest shit show. And virtually none of the people in it have any of the rigor or even interest or curiosity to be able to even map and triangulate the lineages of that thought tangle. And yet they're in it smugly holding forth, right, that they've hacked the secrets to the universe and that this gathering of beautiful people is in fact the way forward for humanity. And I mean, nothing drives me closer to being a lone shooter than hanging out in situations.
I've had moments in the last 12 months where I felt nihilist. I felt like I can't handle this culture. But then, it's been dispiriting, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, yes, and right. The only reason it's dispiriting is I keep banging my head against the same fuckwits, right? If you actually pivot and you turn around and you look at good homegrown humans, in this case, just regular people doing their best, right? There's infinite amounts of uplift. There's infinite confirmations of the human spirit, of dignity, of grace under pressure. There's so much of it. It's just not in the leather and feather scene.
Okay, so I think we've both looked at the kind of some of the mechanics of ecstasy, so the context, the set and setting, and so on. You've been part of this movement, consciousness hacking. You said earlier.
I actually, I mean, I'm friendly with Mikey on that. Okay. I critique the shit out of consciousness hacking.
Oh, right. I don't know much about it, so I was going to ask you about it. Okay, so it's not really okay. But earlier in our conversation, you said, you can medicalize and domesticate the ecstatic, but then there's also like, where are we going? Where is it taking us with things like psychedelics? Now, so in your great recent book, Recapture the Rapture, you talk a bit about the metaphysics and the God thing. And now what I appreciate is that you're trying to keep it an open source kind of broad church, the movement. So you're not going to say this is what it means, and if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. However, I'm curious for you personally, when you've had different kinds of, I don't know, experiences, or just generally in your life, how do you make sense of these things? What is your kind of metaphysics theology about some of the places we go? I mean, obviously that's a big question, so to answer it how you want, kind of thing. But,
yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. So one about the notion of mapping, like to me, and I mean, this entire book actually came from the conducting of the experiments described in the book. So we stumbled into these set of protocols, and then it disclosed through a series of iPhone voice messages over the span of 5 years exactly what this book was, including more of itself. So it was this recursive, time-bending hyperobject, masquerading as narrative nonfiction. So like that's the bit under the rug. I didn't start the book going, "Hey guys, hair on fire. Guess the fucking what just happened," right? Because no one would have bought it. So I had to just do this elaborate Malcolm Gladwell, Trojan horse. Like we're gonna check out a neuroscientist and an action sports athlete and an artist, and along the way we're gonna learn these neat things, right? It's not how it happened at all. So for me,
are you talking about Recapture the Rapture?
Yeah.
Okay. So so the actual process was more of a kind of tell me about that.
It was a backdoor, random, unintended mystical initiation into time traveling sex magic.
Okay, okay, there you go. There's your blurb.
Yeah. I mean, it was just like, what the ever living fuck is this? And then like, holy shit, I think we've cracked the cheat codes. Holy shit, we're not the first. Yeah, it's just the only thing we might be novel in is describing it in a absolutely parsimonious fashion in the terms of 21st century Western neuroscience and psychology. That's it. However, it's fucking rad, and you can go there too. And holy shit, it is absolutely gobsmacking to enter reliably non-ordinary, highly information-rich realms of consciousness and or access to some, information layer, and then bring it back with you and act on the contents therein. So if so to me, that to me is still a fascinating inquiry that virtually nobody's having, which is like, come on, guys, we're all bungee jumping back and forth here into the back of beyond. At some point, don't we triangulate the coordinates, and don't we start layering in the topography and potentially the physics of that domain so that we can better understand it together? And we can, because, if you think the Greeks had the muses, other people have called it the grace of God, people have been visited by angels or divinity, every tradition, dream time in the Aboriginal tradition, everybody's got some very specific descriptor of not actually me, not actually here and now. It was information that was perfect, that was beautiful, that was elegant, that was beyond my ken, whatever. And now we've brought it into 3D, into civilization, into culture, technology, art, religion, philosophy, belief. And we've been doing that for fucking ever. And yet nobody has talked about it in a coherent way. So to me, that notion of what does quantum consciousness and culture, and not in a shitty new age way, in a very specific and technical way that's congruent with physics, what might quantum culture look like, and quantum consciousness? And my best working analogy is that I imagine it would be comparable to the advent of language in early Homo sapiens, in the same way that we were, monkeys without clothes prior to logos. And then we uploaded that capacity, and we were able for abstraction, we collapsed time, we did all sorts of fascinating things, and it gave us a massive boost up on just being a little monkey. What would articulating and then coherently inhabiting together the extra layer of software of quantum consciousness and culture, what might that do to our existence and the future as hominids? Interesting question.
So you obviously towards the end of the book, you talk about the Jesuit priest paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, and he had a similar kind of thing, a kind of evolutionary mysticism, an idea that we're evolving to this new level of kind of accessing the new sphere, this kind of global planetary consciousness, which is also somehow divine and part of the cosmos as well.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'm not a card-carrying Teilhardian, right? I mean, it's sort of more like that was the friendliest story and historical precedent that I could put out there to just sort of signpost, like, hey, like. And the other thing is that I was trapped on how to repatriate Christianity as a mythopoetics, because I kept, in non-ordinary states of my own, continued to have an experience that felt Gnostic, mystic, Christic, and didn't know what to do with it because the branding of organized Christianity is so shitty. So you're like, if the moment you say, like, I think there was some Christ consciousness thing, I think there's some light body thing, I think there's some Kairos Chronos crossy thing, what the fuck? Like, you can't even blurt out the first sentence before people are like backing away, thinking you're going to try and convert them to something.
I was going to ask you about that, because the two things that kind of struck me in when you're talking about God and that difficult thing. On the one hand, you talked about the experience of crying in a bookstore in Boulder when you happened to see a rabbi talk, and you realized your deep connection to this.
No, I waited till I got home. I am.
Where did you go home? Okay, to the kind of Judeo-Christian tradition, which of course nothing could be less fashionable in spirituality. It's sometimes called ABC, anything but Christian. So you acknowledge this connection to the kind of sacrificial figure and to the figure of Jesus. So that's one thing, and then the other thing is the information layer. You talk about that, but these seem to be different things. One is very Platonic, rather mathematical, quite kind of Silicon Valley engineering, and the other is more, blood and guts and Jesus and there doesn't really, I can imagine would make Silicon Valley run a mile if you start talking about Jesus. Or so are these different things, or do they meet for you?
No, they absolutely meet. They 100% fucking meet. So it's the, and to be clear, I only have sort of passing reference to the Nazarene as an historical or scriptural figure. And if anything, and that was something weird about going to Catholic school, because like in a Catholic church, there's all the stations of the cross, and on a Good Friday, they go and it's like Jesus falls a first time and he falls a second time. And, it's just the Mel Gibson shit. It's like gory, macabre, really bleak. But what I realized is that there were beats of his story that I found profoundly helpful in a sort of adept's journey. Right. There's the whole temptation of Satan. You can have all this if you only fucking throw the switch. And that's arguably the seduction of cities. Right. As you gain capacities that emerge with contemplative practice, energetic practice, etc., does it go to your head or not? Interesting. Right. And then the entire sort of what's it called? The Passion Week. I mean, the idea of, hey, I'm really scared. Stay awake with me, friends, in the Garden of Gethsemane. And they all fucking flake out and nod out. Right. So you're like, oh, so that's the lack of mastery of the physical, right? They were lost to their bodies. There's the Peter cock crows 3 times, the lack of mastery, the caving to social pressure, betrayal, right? There's all the, and if this cup be not mine, right? The idea of like, fuck, I really don't want to have to do this, but I'm going to have to do it. Right. All the way to, it is accomplished, right? So I think there is a mystic Gnostic narrative in the Nazarene's tale that I think is super interesting, but it's not the conventional.
But it's funny because there's go on. Sorry, I interrupted. Yeah.
Well, I think the element, like the core element, is and I mentioned this in the sort of American songbook idea, but like redemption songs, like the idea of being broken open and prevailing. To me, that's profoundly human. So that just speaks to us at our ground level. Like not some perfectibility, not some bypass, not some new age bullshit, but like right here, right now, it sucks. It really hurts. It's terrifying and it's uncertain. Do it anyway. And if you can do that, and there is something profound and transformative that can come of it. And then to me, the middle part is this Kairos Chronos. If we can be in the deep now, be in the sacred of Kairos at the same time as not wiggling off the hook of Chronos, of these earthbound mortal existences, right? And can we bear witness with the beating, bleeding heart at the intersection of both? That is the location that catapults you to the information layer. So it is actually the location, right, that gets you to the infinite. So it's not that they're bifurcated, and I get
right.
Yeah. But I would push back on necessarily the Silicon Valley analog. The only reason I'm naming it the information layer versus Godhead or source or heaven or the Akashic field or fill in the fucking blank is that they're all just polluted. So let's just name it something so bland that no one is tempted to weave that into their pre-existing narrative and just say, hey, this is experimental and experiential. If you end up in a place of hypercognition and data access, great. Then we can start triangulating our experiments. And if you end up someplace with dragons and fairies and princesses, interesting, potentially different. The question is, are you getting sucked into your reality tunnels, or are you staying up on the dashboard of observing perspective? And I think that a huge thing that happens in definitely New Age traditions, but even in mutations of existing religions, is people tell you you're trapped in the reality tunnel of conventional consumerism, rational egoic identity, fill in the blank of what the problem case is. We're going to bust you out of that, fill in the blank of transformative technique or practice. It could be group therapy and encounters. It could be psychedelics. It could be breath work. It could be Vipassana, take your pick. So there's a technique of ecstasy. Then we get to this other domain. But before the cement is even dry, we start calcifying and enclosing that ontology. So we've just introduced you to a newer, brighter, shinier, sexier fucking reality tunnel. So you're still trapped. It might be now with ayahuasca or angel guides or whatever your new story is, but it's just another reality tunnel. And so can we actually liberate people? So the point where it's not just you're swapping out your 2008 app for a 2021 app that has more features and maybe 3D and Pokemon. It's can you actually realize here's the home screen, with all the apps, or even who the fuck is holding the iPad, you know? And those are all perspectival shifts that I think support homegrown humans, support independent, common sense, standing on your own 2 feet, good people.
Yeah. Did you you talked about always looking for kind of Dumbledores or King Arthurs to kind of lay your sword down? Did you ever find that? Did you find kind of mentors or elders? Have you found that in your life?
Short answer is no. And the longer answer is, but you know, I did end up finding my life partner at the age of 18. So there was kind of a sense of, oh, well, we're missing these certain pieces that I thought I wanted or needed. And on the other hand, we were blessed with a traveling companion and wouldn't trade that for anything. And then the other part was my frustrated search and having to build things from first principles, right? Because there wasn't anybody giving me the logbook, you know, or the you know, the helping friendly book, like, here you go, right? Also, I hope, and this would be, you know, for others to decide, is part of what's been helpful about the road we had to travel and map and navigate is that here it is, somebody fucking did it. Like, and it's not like I'm going to be somebody's Dumbledore with the ideas that we don't, you know, like Dumbledore is dead, long live Dumbledore, right? Like, here's the ways to navigate with a compass, a map and compass yourself.
And did you ever try to join a religion or a movement?
Fuck no. I mean, and that's the point. Like, it's like so you asked the deities question, and it was multi-part or like tripartite, right? Which was what's the relationship with the human experience, the broken open redemption, doing it anyway? What's the location in both body and mind of Kairos Chronos, and then what's the access point to the information layer? In the book, I did also describe the invocation, instantiation, and kind of effectively kind of charging up of deities. And this is true in Tibetan Buddhism. This is true in Western magical traditions, Crowley, you know, that whole crew, the idea of like, you literally kind of like make your gods, you know, you with will, with imaginal, with recurring imaginal, with iconography, with all these things. And in some, you know, by all accounts, they appear to stand up and work in some interesting way. I've never gone near that shit because I didn't have a Dumbledore. Right. The same reason I've always been super duper arm's length on things like DMT and hyperspace, because it was like, holy fuck, we're getting lobbed into domains that clearly are alive and apparently consequential. And none of us that I'm aware of have any real fucking idea what we're doing or what's going on. So we are rolling the dice with, you know, fundamentally sanity and consequence in ways to me that feels reckless and untethered. Right. So the same with any kind of intentional magic. I've just never felt like I have a clue, and I've never felt remotely competent, you know, to presume that I could then, you know, conjure elemental forces and stay on top of that shit.
I'm glad to hear it. Same here. But I've got to ask you, I mean, you mentioned that some of the inspiration for Recapture the Rapture came from kind of tantric sex magic. It could tell us more. Like, I mean, is that kind of like, I don't know much about it. I read a book on sex magic by Hugh Urban, who's a great kind of, I think he's a student of Kripal's. But was it this kind of thing, like sex magic, or?
Well, I mean, what it was, you know, like the vomit comet, you know, like that big plane that does the parabolic arcs, and then people preparing to be astronauts get sort of 15 to 30 seconds of 0G. Right. I mean, it was more like a sexual yoga of becoming. So body work, breath work, gas assisted breath work, hand, like minimal, and this was all laid out in the book, right? So cannabinoids, oxytocin.
Oh yeah, you give a list
arguably
of these things.
Ketamine, you know, intranasal ketamine, various things, all prescription, all kind of very above board. Oxygen, you know, like nitric oxide as well. Like, just how do you hack and optimize a human nervous system, and then how do you take turns lobbing each other into 0G? And then what do you see? And then come back and take turns and swap. So in that respect, very, very unpretentious. Like there were no fancy waistcoats. And what one of the things that prompted one of our friends is a PhD in Tibetan religious studies, and he sent me this cutting edge paper on Tibetan Tantra, and I read it. I remember reading it like on Christmas Eve because I was like so fascinated. I was like, finally, I've got the goods. Someone has sent me the ticket, and I read through the entire thing, and it was still all wrapped in crazy esoterica and unfalsifiable truth claims, and you could not separate wheat from chaff. You could not get to just a straight ass protocol. It was all in iconography and esoterica. So for me, I truly am, and maybe it's a chronic lack of imagination on my part, but I am an agnostic Gnostic. I continually have, blow your doors off experiences that I cherish and I orient my life around. And that's the Gnostic part. And the agnostic part is I have no fucking idea what any of it means or where it comes from.
Does it ever give you a sense, you mentioned this in DMT, of kind of fear and trembling, of like, ooh, like Raiders of the Lost Ark type thing?
Oh, I mean, for me, I'm fairly clear at this point that I have been asymmetrically blessed with more than a lifetime's glimpses of the numinous. And the weak link is not going back to that wishing well. The weak link is, how do I show up for my family and what do I do on Monday morning? My weak link is incredibly banal. It's down, it's literally down at the level of being human in the world, in the dog days of February, right? Like that's it. The idea that we are light dressed up as matter, and that, and that we're all just temporary here. Like yes, for sure. And so now let's get about the living. And it's, endlessly humbling, but also grounding, which is, yes, it's important to make sure you haven't kind of forgotten things you'd remembered. It's important to kind of keep that blade clean and sharp. But as far as just being compelled to be a tourist of the sublime in perpetuity, when there's so much to be done in the here and now, that doesn't feel tenable. And I think you're also asking for it. I think my sense is that at least the way we've experienced the infinite game being played is, go to the numinous, be shown that which you need to know, come home, do your homework, level up, and the next time you get there, you will be rewarded with the next level of the game. But on the other hand, if you go to the numinous, you forget what you were shown, you bugger off your homework, and you want to go back anyway because you just remember it was really fucking fun, you are opening yourself for an absolute ass whipping, and a world of hurt, and then potentially kind of like karma on overdrive, which is now you're monkeying with things you probably have no business monkeying with. So you're amplifying up the forces and the vectors, and then you're coming back into your world and things come unglued at an exponential rate. Sure. Which is why these things were always esoteric.
Happens all the time, doesn't it? Spiritual bypassing, people using ecstatic states as a way of avoiding showing up for their marriage or whatever.
Yeah, but actually, can I just finish on the deities thing? Because there is a point that I didn't share in the book because I just ran out of space, basically. But this is the piece, because for me, there is something beautiful, and this is, Immanuel Kant, right? The idea of be careful. Actually, no, Nietzsche, where he says, be careful when you kill your gods, right? Because you rip out the whole social moral fabric with them, right? So that's the piece that most people kind of miss on his God is dead proclamation. And so the question is how can we reclaim deity worship in a postmodern, non-dogmatic way? Is that even workable? And for a long time, I couldn't see a way through that. But then I had this thought. I actually lost a couple of friends. Actually, I lost 5 friends in 11 months to tragic deaths. And we were in our practice. So I was kind of I was sort of surfing that 0G space. And I kind of had this experience of Tom Sawyer's funeral, like that Mark Twain one, where they've gone to the island and everybody thinks they're dead, and then they sneak back into town and they crawl into the church and they see everybody giving the eulogies and weeping, and they're like, this is fucking fantastic, right? So I had that kind of a vision, but it was of my best friends, and I was offering up what I loved about them. Like, what was their light? What was their spark? What was their sort of absolute essence that I cherished and was now grieving, in their loss? And they were each different. One was, it was his laugh and his humor. The other was his rascally nature of always creating adventures, all the different things, right? And they were also totally fallible guys. There were other things that completely pissed me off or bummed me out or whatever they did, right? But there was this sense of like, oh my God, could we effectively, like Voltron, like a transformer almost, could we honor the light in each of us in a group? Let's just say you got a dozen dear friends. Could you truly name and honor the light that is the 10% of each of us? And out of that, could you assemble anthropos? Could you assemble a perfected human that is created by all of us, but is none of us? And it could even include the one who's always tempted to grab the ring, right? You could even include, right? And buddy, like, I fucking get it that you want to be him, but none of us are. None of us ever could be. But together we can power that up. And then what would that deity, right, instantiated, imaginally generated, right, be? Because we would be anchoring and supporting him or it or her, and yet it would be built into the code that none of us is fucking trying to take that claim. Because that's the other thing that we're seeing in this spiritual self-actualization space, right? People power up into their charismatic light body cells, and a lot of motherfuckers are taking the claim right now. A lot of people are doing the Boromir, like, but if I grab this ring, look, I could do so much with it. I could be king of Gondor, and the idea is like, put it fucking down, like that way lies ruin. So that's my current working hypothesis is can we effectively crowdsource the divine? And then can we unlock the love, the dedication, and the devotion, right? The devotion to something higher and bigger and better than ourselves, which is actually generated by all of us together, that doesn't lead to subjugation, that doesn't lead to a priest class, that doesn't lead to a lot of the pathologies we've seen around deities, but still allows us love and awe and service to something greater than our own meat suit selves.
Yes, that's beautiful. I haven't seen that yet in spirituality. Something that I became a Christian when I was writing my book, The Art of Losing Control. Like I was writing about ecstatic Christianity, and then went in at the deep end and was a Christian for all of a year and a half until I was like, who am I kidding? Like, after the high had come down. But for a while, God, I really wanted to be like a better person. I really wanted to try and serve God. I could see that button is powerful, for really trying to make people be devoted and selfless, because it's easier to be devoted to a kind of idea of a God of love who loves you. Maybe because it taps into the little kid who wants to be good for like their parents or something. I don't know. But I
think it's effective scaffolding.
Yeah.
Right. You've literally, rather than having to reinvent your existential philosophical drive and code of ethics every day from scratch in a pell-mell world that's coming at you faster than most of us can handle, you've offloaded into something stable and elevated and aspirational. Like there is real functionality there.
Yes, I mean functionality, yes, but also relationality as well. You know what I mean? Like this kind of thing. I mean, it's a relationship thing as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and to be clear, right? I mean, because you mentioned my sort of relationship with God. I mean, I don't pray. I never have, not once. And I actually acknowledged that the other night to some friends, and I said it out loud, and I was like, "That's kind of weird. Am I weird?" But it always seemed presumptuous. And back to the kind of white magic versus black magic, I never wanted to be attempting to bend the weave to anything resembling personal desire. So it's sort of
bend
more
the weave, what kind of, in other words, wish fulfillment.
Yeah, like it was sort of like, I'm going to do my best to live aligned as I can with whatever the hell feels like it's coming through me. And I kind of feel like that has to be enough, because the beseeching or supplicative prayer, I mean, maybe, I could just be dumb. I could be unimaginative. I could be just stupid and prideful. I have no idea what like, again, no Dumbledores, no Gandalfs, right? So you're like, I don't fucking know. But all I know is that some form of kind of non-specific chaos magic feels more natural to me, which is do your best to do the right thing and trust the Tao.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. Jamie, thank you. Let me ask you kind of, really enjoyed this conversation. As a kind of takeaway, if if there was like one thing you think that you could like make happen in spirituality to make it a bit more healthy, what would you love to see happen in this culture that we're in?
I think maybe like sort of I mean, you know, and hopefully, I mean, whatever, we'll see. I don't hold out any delusions on whether this book will get to do it, but the building blocks are in it, which would be a global decentralized movement of self-organizing flash mobs of church, right? That works in a ritual, and again, including, you know, synchronized consumption of prescription pharmaceuticals in a high vibe celebratory environment that delivers people to anamnesis, the forgetting of the forgetting, such that, right, through movement, through organized song and movement, through breath work, through all of the things, an ecstatic real sacrament that delivers them to this I remember, and today I begin again. And that people everywhere around the world have a way to metabolize their grief, remember what they forgot, reaffirm their connections to each other, and get back up and live the remaining 6 days of that week with a little bit more light, a little bit more courage, and a little bit more clarity.
That sounds a bit like church.
By any other name.
Brilliant. What are you finding? Just what are you working on now? What's you're about to do a retreat?
Yeah, we're doing Camp Omega, right? So how a camp up in the
Awesome.
mountains, the Rocky Mountains near Aspen, to deliver exactly this thing. So this is just going to be our best cut using the same Lego blocks that we've just kind of shared in Recapture the Rapture, and it's going to be everything from an amazing folk band called Rising Appalachia, who's bringing basically gospel karaoke to percussion to aikido to embodiment to theory, literature, and general good times. So we're going to take a cut at this homegrown humans culture as well.
Brilliant. Well, I hope that goes really well and you enjoy it too. And thank you very much. Great talking
for
to
sure,
you.
man.
All right. See you.
Cheers.